I don't think there are any examples of something which might look like socialism. I don't think they exist or can exist. It doesn't exist, and it cannot exist. You cannot have forms of socialism or socialism, given the nature, the international and systemic nature of socialism and of capitalism. I don't think anybody here actually believes in a gradual evolution from one to the other. Natural result. One doesn't actually believe that such a thing can actually exist. Capitalism is a system, or it is not, and socialism equally is a system, an international system. And consequently, there cannot actually be socialist forms in a capitalist environment. Of course, that was the viewpoint of some Stalinist and semi-Stalinist theoreticians, who then argued that there was this tremendous difficulty with socialism, unlike capitalism, which already had forms in existence in order to overthrow feudalism. Socialism doesn't actually have this. Consequently, it's far more difficult for socialism to come into existence. And of course, various what amounts to social democratic theoreticians have been arguing in terms of various socialist forms, and of course we have the existence of various entities like the cooperative movement or the kibbutz or whatever, but it doesn't seem to me that they have anything to do with socialism or anticipations of socialism or what you would expect socialism to be like, or anything else if you want to add a few more words. In the past, or even today, some people have seen these things as such. My own experience of the cooperative movement has been personally disastrous in every instance. Every time I tried to use it, it certainly appeared to be anti-human. And I did try to use it for critique, and the result was just hopeless. In particular, because at the time it was controlled by Stalin, so I tried to get critique bound. I went to the local cooperative in Glasgow, cooperative printing press, and I refused to do it, basically because it was critical of the Soviet Union. When eventually I persuaded them to bind it, because one person was more sympathetic, apparently I had a political meeting about it, and I bound it, and it immediately fell to pieces. That to me is a symbol of where it is or where it could be. So I'm not trying to find anything which looks anything like socialism. So what we're really talking about, I presume, which is why the topic came up, is that it relates to the whole question of decline. And the way I understand it, decline of a system is decline of its fundamental law, systemic law, the law of value. If the law of value is in decline, then we have to look at what that actually means. And the way I understand it, there are two aspects of it. The destructive aspect, finance capital on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have to have alternative entities in order to run what exists. In other words, capitalism has to become more organized, consciously organized by the capitalist class in one form or another. And I presume it's the second of this that I'll be talking about. First, because I said that I would do it because of the questions which arose. I'll just quickly run over the aspect of decline which I see in finance capital. I have to say, I still find it amazing that people are worried or question the concept in the way they do. It's a perfectly reasonable to question any concept, of course. But the concept of finance capital has been very much part of the socialist movement for over a century. If you read Trotsky's 1905, you see in the very first chapter, he just assumes the existence of finance capital and describes it. Because, of course, it was very important at the time and later within the development of Russia. And in fact, it's crucial to understand what was happening in 1905 and later in 1917. And of course, we know that they nationalized foreign property, finance capital, and that completely knocked out France for years, or probably knocked them out forever in one sense. But it was Lenin, of course, who actually developed the concept, but it became then very much part, I think, of all groups' viewpoint. That doesn't make it correct, of course. Nonetheless, one really ought to look at that detail and see what it's trying to explain. It really is fundamental to Lenin's conception of capitalism and his explanation of the development of capitalism and his explanation of the war, of course, and his own opposition to the war. Okay, well, I've already referred to it and referred to helpfully. Finance capital is abstract capital. It's abstract from production itself and abstract from location. In that sense, it's abstract capital. So it can be located everywhere and therefore can locate whatever it's controlling anyway, insofar as that's possible. That's in direct contrast with industrial capital. The consequence also of that is that because capital becomes finance capital, which is the dominant form, and as I pointed out, the point difference between finance capital and financial capital is that finance capital dominates capital as a whole. It abstracts itself from its position in circulation and comes to control the entire process. And then, as I said, it becomes itself abstract. And its entire aim is to reproduce itself as quickly as possible without going through any intermediaries. Unlike, of course, productive capital, which has to go, industrial capital, which has to go through production itself. Finance capital doesn't want to do it, and if it possibly can, it doesn't do it. Now you must say, how can it not do it? Well, how is it that almost 1/3 today of British GDP is in finance capital? I think the figure I picked up last time was something like up to 10 million people are related or in finance capital within Britain. But even if we reduce the figure somewhat, it's enormous. Now that is not, it's not just not productive capital. It's actually destructive capital. But it is certainly not within production, and what it is doing is absorbing surplus value. I'm not going to go with the theory of it, and everybody realizes that that you have productive capital and unproductive capital, capital which does not produce surplus value. So in other words, you have a very large sector within the British economy which is simply absorbing surplus value. And it's not absorbing it in the forms which would say further humanity. As society progresses, as we know, that unproductive aspects increase. Education, health, etc. increases. Number of people involved increases, becomes more important, and you would expect that in socialism it would become use value, of course, becomes an aim, and you expect that these sectors would come to be dominated. So its anticipation is precisely in the fact that these sectors become more and more important within capitalism. Not surprisingly, capitalism is not, capital is often not very keen on it. But one aspect of what we're talking about is finance capital itself, and that isn't a use value in the sense which mankind needs, requires, or whatever. It's a particular way in which capital is operating in its own decline. An increasing amount, in other words, of capital becoming unproductive in organizing capital itself, in increasing the rate of profit, and therefore reducing the amount of surplus value which might otherwise go to the production of use values for general consumption. Now, but above all, it is short-termist. If one reads the Marxist literature, of course, on it, the whole emphasis is on its destructive, predatory nature, and that's absolutely correct. The way in which it's destructive, you can see immediately, you just think of private equity, which seems to be, as it were, it's almost its ultimate form, where it becomes cannibalistic, it turns in on itself and absorbs and attacks itself in order to raise its own rate of profit. But you should just look at the kind of thing which occurred in the last year, in which private equity was proposing to buy Sainsbury. Now what they were proposing to do, now Sainsbury itself is largely unproductive in the retail sector. It's not wholly unproductive. Transport is not unproductive, and packaging is not in itself unproductive. But advertising is, and the actual collection of money is unproductive. Now, what it was proposing to do is quite simply to borrow large quantities of money from the bank via Sainsbury, load the entire loan on Sainsbury itself and on themselves, pay interest, of course, which would then be offset against tax, so the taxpayer would be paying, and then sell off the property on which the shops, supermarkets were situated. Having then acquired what amounted to a huge quantity of money, which would probably exceed the initial cost, they could then sell the thing back to the or refloat it on the stock market, repay the loan, which in any case, say, a large part of which had been paid by which was paid for anyway by Sainsbury itself, and the interest allowed to a considerable extent to the taxpayer, and with the result get an enormous profit running in billions. The end result, of course, would be that you would have a firm. Now, in this case, I've taken Sainsbury, but it could just as well be a firm in the machine tool sector, or an airplane company, or some or Boeing, or God knows what they could acquire. But the company would then be left with this huge debt, and without its initial properties, the properties in which it actually existed, the land, the buildings, which would belong to some landlord, to whom it would have to pay rent. The result, of course, would be that company would have great difficulty in making profits, and the profit would be very low, and who knows whether it could actually survive. Now, that has been its mode of operation in an immediate period. In an earlier period, somebody talked about the 70s, when there was a downturn, though nothing like what we're getting now. I think the comparison with Tesla is actually wrong, but there is some comparison with it. During the 70s, if you remember, you had Slater Walker and the whole property crash at the time. Well, at that time, what they were doing, again, was buying up enterprises and basically, as I said, asset stripping. So they're stripping out the assets and throwing away everything else. So destroying the firm itself. Now, what would have happened to Sainsbury would almost certainly be that the firm would be destroyed and would be broken up, and God knows what else would actually happen in the end. I've only given that as an example to understand the destructive nature of the finance capital in itself. Now, it's true that it has to get a certain value from somewhere. If all it does is keep destroying, then you don't get anything left, of course. So from time to time, what it has done is operate in various ways in which to ensure that it does, like buying up firms or using its capital to transfer firms from one country to another. Now, the aspect of capitalism under finance capital, which is crucial, is that a whole of capital is in the end subordinate to it. And that means that if you look at industrial capital, it is subordinate to the finance capitalist ethos. An example of that, for instance, was that in the days when GEC existed, before it imploded because of the stupidity of the new manager, remember in 2000, GEC was the biggest British industrial company, and Arnold Weinstock was its managing director. In those days, it refused to produce chips, like Intel or whatever. It refused to go into it. Unlike in Germany, where obviously Siemens went into production of computer chips, and unlike the United States, obviously, in various other countries, Britain didn't do it. And Arnold Weinstock was asked, well, why didn't you do it? He said, well, we can't make money out of it. Finished. In other words, unless there was immediate profit as quickly as possible, finance capital would not invest. Now that's Britain was the first finance capitalist country. It remains a finance capitalist country, and today it's almost an extreme finance capitalist country. And it is the case even today that if you, well, today you won't get any money at all, of course, but let's say it has remained the case until the credit crunch, that if you went to a bank in Britain and you were able to borrow money, they'd expect you to repay in 18 months. If you went to Germany, they would give you 22 years. Now, roughly. Now, that's the difference, as I've said many times. Although I think Hilferding's account in theoretical terms is extremely useful and basically correct, his reference to Germany as the prime finance capitalist country is actually wrong. It was Britain. Well, it is Britain. If we look at it today, we're talking of the Anglo-Saxon countries, America and Britain were overshot, which together dominate the world in that sense of setting the parameters for capital as a whole. France, Germany, Japan continue basically along the industrial capitalist line, although they have to be subordinate to finance capital in the world market. Anyway, so the essential point there is that capital as a whole, industrial capital, becomes subordinate, and therefore it itself is forced to be short-termist. And Hilferding makes the point that since finance capital wants its money, and if it holds stakes in a number of firms in a particular industry, it'll force them to come together, whether they have a cartel or become a monopoly, which in general terms would be true. And his point behind that, of course, would be that you get lower levels of competition, consequently there's lower levels of innovation, etc. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is make capitalism itself is changed, reduced in its productivity, and in part destroyed by finance capital. Although I put it perhaps more explicitly and added a few things, what I've said isn't particularly new. That is the classical theory of finance capital. Now that's the destructive aspect of the decline in value. The non-destructive aspect is presumably much more of what is in the title. In other words, the way in which value in general is in direct decline, and the way in which there are aspects of capitalism or aspects of society which come into to replace it. Well, I'll just then take a step back and say what we're talking about in historical terms. We're talking about a shift towards socialism, which in the first instance would be the overthrow of capitalism and the institution of a transitional process. As I understand it, there'll be a period, let's say an immediate period, in which the economies presumably will have to deal with the previous fighting, the results of the fighting, the previous destruction, or whatever it is, in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. As that is dealt with, there'll be a transition process. A transition process away from the market towards socialism. And I've said many times, historically, until Stalin, most Marxists made no distinction between socialism and communism. Marx did and had no time for socialism. Historically, if you actually look at what was said by Lenin or Trotsky or whosoever, before 1918 they made no such distinction. And if you want to, you can, but it seems to be completely wrong to do that. So, it was Stalin in particular, although it was being used under non-Stalin's period, 1917 to 23, it's increasingly being used or being used. But if you actually look at Lenin, it's usually within that word socialism, usually within quotation marks, at least in Russia. So one has a transition period. And the essential basis of that transition period is the movement away from the market. Now, of course, what I'm saying is that transition is already occurring within capitalism. That is the point. And in a sense, the people who argue that there isn't any transition before the event, as it were, unlike the period from feudalism to capitalism, are actually wrong. The transition itself is extremely difficult. I'm not talking about Soviet Union, which I'll come to. Any such transition will be extremely difficult because it's very hard to imagine how you can abolish one system of incentives and introduce a new system of incentives before you actually have a genuine world socialism. One of the points, well, Prigozhinsky made the point, as a slogan. He said, we have lost the incentives of capitalism and we don't have the incentives of socialism. Now, that was true at the time in Soviet Union, but it would be true in any transition. How then do you get the thing moving at all? Nobody's come up with an answer. I mean, you fudge the thing and say, well, we go slowly or do whatever, but it's not that easy. Now, what I'm saying, of course, is that aspects of the process exist today, and in that sense, it's an anticipation of the transition process. Or what am I talking about here? Well, just imagine that you have a factory or an institution or whatever within socialism. Can you exploit workers? Well, you have to. You have no alternative. You have to have a surplus in order to reinvest, in order to build up to the point where you will have abundance. You have no choice. So you are going to exploit them. Now you can say you're not exploiting them because it's in their interest. But on the other hand, you haven't reached such a high level that it won't affect their actual standard of living and indeed their incentives at the time. So in other words, what you have to do immediately is to raise the level of consciousness where everybody understands that everything's being done in their long-term interest. Well, obviously that's impossible in the first instance. Over time, that will become possible as the educational system comes to express it. But it's not a question of propaganda. No. In the Soviet Union, as far as I can see, nobody believes in propaganda, unlike the nonsense produced in the bourgeois presses, if everybody changed their mind. You can print whatever you like in the newspapers. People are not stupid. They don't automatically believe what's there when the reality is quite different. So it has to be part of the educational process for people to understand what is actually going on, which takes some time to actually be absorbed. It's not just a question of wages, even if you assume that it's a reasonable standard of living. It's the conditions of the work you're talking about, how people interrelate, the abolition of hierarchy, the institution of the democratic process within the factory, control from below, that within the factory there should be a human environment. Now all that just can't come in automatically. It has to come in gradually over time as the labor process itself is elevated. There's no way of running a production line in a humane form. It's simply, a production line is inhumane. There's no way of digging coal with a spade and call it a humane way of working. That's to say, as soon as you're going to go below ground and have all the carbon monoxide and the rest of it. If you really are going to get coal in that way, people are going to be sacrificing their lives as they have in the past. So one has to be able to go from this position where the work process is inhumane or semi-inhumane or whatever you want, to one where it is fully human. That can only really happen where machines make machines, where people don't have to go down into the middle of the earth in order to dig out coal, assuming to coal in the first place. So you have a transition period of whatever time it will be. It won't be 6 months or even 5 years. A fair period of time in which you have a hierarchical system, however you put it, where some people are doing manual labor and some people are white-collar workers. Now, that really is unacceptable in socialism. But one has to get beyond it, so one has to go through a process in doing that. Part of course, what is important in all this is the growth of machinery. The fact that in the end machines will be making machines was, as I said, anticipated before Marx by Hegel. It's actually in his book on law. I've got the page number somewhere. Everybody doesn't believe me. And of course, if we look around us, the process of automation is clearly increasing. But it's going a lot slower than it could do. And in this respect, it's not being helped by China. But the logic of production, you would have thought, would have been, say, in Britain or America or France, that human beings would be replaced by machines very quickly, the process of automation would be much quicker, instead of which it's actually cheaper to have a lot more people in China producing whatever it is. Didn't make that point yesterday. No doubt a few people will reject she said that. But insofar as, in other words, as there are aspects of cheap labour, in other words, controlled labour, people still coming in from the villages, human beings will still be so controlled that they have to work for a pittance. Finance capital prefers to use them rather than going for machinery. So on the one hand we have the potential, on the other hand we have the reality where it's still the case that people are being super exploited, and in this respect it is not an anticipation of socialism at all. The logic, of course, of machines making machines, or increased level of machinery, is an increased integration of production. And of course that is what is the basis of Marx's famous statements within the last section of Capital, when he's talking about the main contradiction, or the contradiction of Capital, being between the socialization of production on the one hand and ever smaller units of big capital on the other. So the essential basis, therefore, of capital is the increasing socialization of production, or of capital, or labour, which involves increasing levels of integration and further development of the division of labour, which is indeed the real anticipation of what will happen during a transition period, and the possibility, therefore, of organising production in a conscious way. That creates its possibility. But within capitalism, of course, if this is occurring, what one is talking about is the decline of competition. The SWP, which seems for some unknown reason to repudiate Marxism in this respect, I don't know why, but Marx is very clear that competition is not a law of capitalism. It is essential within capitalism to enforce its laws, but it is not a prime law of capitalism. It's essential to enforce the laws of capitalism. So you have to look at the laws of capitalism in the first instance, and then see what's happening to them and whether they're being enforced. To the degree to which competition isn't there, then the laws will not be enforced. That's his logic, that's what Marx says in the hubris, and that's quite clearly the case. So to the extent to which competition has been reduced, which is what is implied in increasing socialization of production, of course, to that degree, you have what's usually referred to as monopoly or oligopoly or whatever. You have a direct decline of the law of value. But its other side is increasingly conscious organization of production. And that obviously is an anticipation of what is to come. The problem with it is that it is, of course, undemocratic. It's run from above in the interests of profit and profit alone. And the conditions of finance capital, all that does count is increasing levels of profit. I should have added that point when I was talking finance capital, because we've seen in the last period how the demands of finance capital have been that share prices go up, up, and up, because that is the main indicator of, for the hedge funds, which allows them to make profits. And whether the profits are real or not, and very often they're not real, let's say the accounting is creative accounting. The crucial thing is that the profits be there, and that it take the form of rising share prices, and so allow the hedge funds and the other derivative-based organizations to get higher and higher profits. Well, the pressure, therefore, to actually do this has to go through an organized process. That's to say, you have a number of executives in a plant who actually think out how they're going to organize the production process, how they're going to skew the reporting of the thing, how they're going to make it appear as if they are in fact making very large profits. But at the same time, they also have to consider how they're actually running the plant. And no doubt everybody here has been in bookshops where you can see shelves and shelves and shelves on management. Usually in the section where you get economics, business management, you have a very small section for economics and a big section for business and a big section for management and a whole section on finance or derivatives. It's not an accident that you have an enormous amount now written on management, because capital today is very conscious of how it must run the firms, partly because of the ineffective decline of value and the attempt to get maximum profit as quickly as possible, but also because of the socialization of production itself, which forces them to actually run the firm in a more direct and conscious manner. Now again, of course, Marx says this in different ways. Marx points out precisely the contradiction between the way in which firms are actually, in inverted commas, planned, as opposed to the market, which is supposedly spontaneous. So, one therefore has a whole series of theories and understanding of how firms ought and are managed. That itself is fantastically interesting, and not everybody's bothered to look at this stuff, or anybody's been unfortunate enough to be in a large corporation and live through the stress of it and the absurdity. It's not just, as it were, that what's going on is you're getting commands which have some sort of sense, and you get higher profits and a product. The actual bureaucratic formation, which is what we're talking about, and now we're not talking about a state which does become bureaucratized. The firms themselves now become perfectly, not perfect, but become examples of bureaucratization. And because you cannot actually run the firms within what is even if tech value is in decline, it's still there, within the market, within a value-creating process on the one hand, and on the other, in a conscious way, it becomes highly contradictory and conflicted. The consequence is that you get 101 different management theories, of course, but no one within the firm really knows how to actually run it except in a purely empirical way and in order to get a result in particular periods. In the present period, of course, in this particular finance capitalist period, you've had some of the most crazy ways of actually running firms, which to a degree work for a time. You must have read of Jack Welch, you know. The biggest US firm, or second biggest, whatever, since it changes from year to year, is General Electric. Jack Welch was the head, the CEO, until I think 3, 4, 5 years ago. And he implemented this doctrine, which came from management theory actually, under which what he did was to divide all the workers, you can imagine how many hundreds of thousands work at General Electric, which all workers were divided into 3 categories. The bottom 10% were fired. Every year they were divided this way, and the bottom 10% were fired. The top lot were rewarded, the middle lot got some sort of middle result. Well, you can imagine how anybody worked in that firm. This is sort of how to manage by terror. Well, as it happens, General Electric has a very strong finance capitalist, not just ethos, it has that social ethos, but a finance capitalist section. And if anybody has a credit card from General Electric, but you can get it in this country. So it's perhaps not surprising that they should do it. But of course, if you do that for a period of time, you'll have a highly stressed workforce, and to a degree you will get higher profits and it'll work. But obviously everybody's going to be thoroughly pissed off in it, except the very top layer. This is sort of an ideal way to see to it that everybody hates the firm and does what they have to do to get promoted and not sacked, and no more. Obviously, and to a degree, for a time, that'll work. After time, it won't work, obviously. So I'm just giving that as an example of the nature of management at the present time, and the fact that at the present time, and precisely because it's subordinate to finance capital, it's got this highly contradictory form of control. Now that isn't true of all firms, of course. That's simply one mode of management. As it happens, he's taken as a prototype. And I don't know if anybody heard him interviewed in Britain, but he was interviewed on Radio 5 for a couple of hours, and the interview was a genius because he managed to get out the contradictions and the absurdity of Jack Welch in doing it, which Jack Welch himself was totally unaware of. Now obviously, if you run firms in that way, what you can guarantee is you will run them down in the long run. So management theory therefore has to go between this and of course caring, sharing type of attitude. And if you read the Financial Times, you'll see that both are expressed, both as your extreme, how you run the firm. On one hand, you have to run the firm so that everybody respects management, management respects everybody, management does its best for everybody to, etc., etc. That's the one theory, and the other is the one I've just expressed. Anyway, the point, of course, is that this is the way in which management is going. That's to say, in a contradictory way, not just in two extremes. It's a highly contradictory way in which it exists. And it must exist in this contradictory way because it is not possible to successfully plan an entity unless everybody's actually involved in it and has some sort of stake in it. If they don't, then of course, even if it isn't the extreme of General Electric as it was, people are not very interested in doing it, and they'll work only up to a certain point. If, of course, they're disillusioned with it, they'll work as badly as possible, which is what you got in the case of the Soviet Union. So, in a social society, what you have to get to is a position where, of course, the associated producers do in fact become involved with planning itself, and that's the only way planning can actually exist in the democratic process where everybody's actually involved. Now, that itself is a complex process. You can't expect that in every aspect of production there'll be a vote, so that you vote every 10 minutes kind of thing. So what one's talking about, as you know, is in a social society, in the end, everybody will be involved at some time in their lives, but not in all times of their lives, in administration. And you're talking about a way in which everybody is able to change their position within the division of labour over time. So because everybody's involved in administration at some point, and because the results of administration are visible quickly, and because nobody's stuck to a particular job, but they change job over time, you can say people become involved with the administration of the society as a whole. But of course, in a social society, you have abundance, so it doesn't actually make that much difference if you happen to make a few mistakes, and whoever makes a decision makes the wrong decision for a time and is incorrect. But it does make a big difference before you get there, in the transitional period. And that is the problem. How do you actually, in the transition period, not go over to the Jack Welch approach, which you couldn't as a socialist. On the other hand, you still nonetheless have to get productive, high levels of productivity. I'm stating this without any solution. Nobody's provided a solution, and I think there's been some discussion of it in left-wing journals. There hasn't been very much more of it. Obviously, you can try and think out various ways one can get around it, but it'll be it'll be solved at the time, but it isn't that easy. So what have I said here? I've said that the result of the socialization of production within capitalism is a decline of competition, rise of monopoly, reduction in innovation, rise of management, increasing importance of management, increasing importance of, what do we call it, pseudo-planning, which is an anticipation of what is to come, but is not in any way socialism. And that's one of the prime aspects of this change. Bureaucracy is a necessary result of the need for increasing levels of administration without democratic controls over the administrators, and also without the incentive system of either capitalism or socialism. Bureaucracy at the level of the state exists in part for this reason, but in large part because of the increasing independence of the state under conditions where the society is in transition. Now I'm using transition in a different sense. That's to say the sense in which the whole world is in transition. Well, clearly the law of value is in decline, and the transition must begin. But I've argued this before. I'm not going to go into the question of the nature of the epoch and the revolution in Russia, as of course, which is absolutely crucial to that.
Okay, I'm just about from the chair, right? I'll give you an hour if you want. 5 minutes.
Okay, well, I've already said is that what we get is the growth of unproductive labour, the growth of education, health, administration, and we refer to them as aspects which must occur in this period. It's not just a question of the socialisation of production here, it's also a question of the increasing strength of the working class, of the need for concessions to it. Education, of course, has to rise precisely because of the socialisation of production, does require increasing levels of skill. And of course, to the degree to which we are talking about improved levels of health education in the developed world, it makes it easier for the transition period itself. So in this whole period, one can expect an increasing level of unproductive labour of two kinds. One kind which would continue, one kind which would be abolished. The kind which would be abolished would be enhanced capital. The logic of this period as it goes along is, of course, that the white-collar group will grow, and the blue-collar group will gradually vanish. That's its logic. And, of course, it's a logic which would certainly be the case within a socialist society. The final point, then, which, of course, I could spend an hour on, is to talk about one of the non-anticipations, and that is the Soviet Union, which obviously existed in this world, and various other countries claiming in some sense to be socialist, which are Stalinists. Well, the question is, what anticipation can you actually get there? Well, I think the only anticipation you get there is what you don't want. What you don't want is control from above, mass atomization, total absence of democracy, the de facto rule by a small elite, whatever you want to call them. Clearly you don't want that. The question is, can one regard the process of control, what is called by Soviet Union itself as planning, and in the West is called modern economy, what I'd call administration or organization. Can one regard this as planning? Obviously not. I mean, the associated producers have nothing whatsoever to do with it, but the results of them having nothing whatever to do with it was very obvious. What you got, as what we really talked about, was the defective product. And of course, as I've said many times, it's always better to get a pullover with only one sleeve than to have pullover than to have no pullover. Or it's better to have size 10 shoes than no shoes, even if your size is 6, which was the case. But it's hardly an efficient method of production. The feature of the Soviet Union was its fantastic level. It wasn't just a level of inefficiency, it's fantastic level of inefficiency. It managed to show the world how it was possible to have a repair sector bigger than the original sector, which is unique. It managed to have a situation where when it put in innovations, it had to construct new factories every time. That was precisely because it couldn't put the innovation into an old factory, because the old factory already had a particular balance of power. It was already running in a particular way, and if you put in a new machine, then it would take years for it to reach its old level of productivity. Obviously, there's no point in that case in putting in a new machine if your level of productivity takes 5 years to actually get there, to get where it should be, by which time, of course, you have to put in a new machine to replace the new machine. So it was better, easier, and generally recognized the thing to do was to put up a new factory in order to encompass the new machine. Of course, it's still true in the West that to a degree that occurs here, but I think the figures usually were that one third of innovations would require new factories. In the Soviet Union, it was just around 2/3 required new factories. Now you just consider what that is, and just, by the way, in relation to China, you can see, if that is the case, you can imagine fantastic growth in GDP. Unfortunately, most of it is going into repairs and into constructing factories which you don't have to construct. But of course, you're going to have very large numbers of cranes, huge skyscrapers, and roads in order to connect these factories which you didn't need in the first place. Now, that was the nature of the Soviet Union. Not unsurprisingly, when it was open to the world market, nothing competed. this level of productivity was fantastically low. Well, obviously, there's no way we can say this is an anticipation of socialism. Well, if we do, we condemn socialism. Who on earth would want such levels of inefficiency? It's not as if the inefficiency benefited the workers. On the contrary, the standard of living was very low. When the Soviet Union came to an end and they were able to tell the truth, although it was very obvious beforehand, the economist said in the Soviet Union what he had was a system of semi-forced labor, which was basically correct. It's semi-forced labor in that you had a whole series of controls compelling people to work, and the returns were very low. They pointed out, they went through statistics, pointed out how poor the actual wages were, how low was the standard of living. It's true that once it collapsed, standard of living went down even further. But if you have a choice between something awful and still worse, maybe you choose the thing awful, choose what is awful. I'm not certain that people would do that, but that's the case. So, in my view, there is nothing, absolutely nothing to learn from the Soviet Union. Talking of this planning system, obviously there are other aspects where only an evil person would want to copy the Soviet Union. Who on earth would want to have a Politburo and run the thing from the top, where you occasionally see to it that some number of people are put into camps. Now, or go back to whatever number of people were killed, 12, 20 million or even more, we just don't know. Anyway, obviously nobody wants to copy that. But note what the question is, and this is a real question, and I've addressed it a number of times in the Soviet Union, in Russia itself, where we've had these debates. Do we have anything to learn from what existed in the Soviet Union in terms of the planning apparatus, how it was run, or whether it was a welfare state? Those are the questions. And I'm answering that what existed there in the name of planning isn't planning. It's the last thing in the world that we want to copy. That isn't to say that there may be a certain amount of research, or there may not be certain mathematical formulae which might be useful. Obviously, that may be the case. The other aspect of whether it was a welfare state, well, it's perfectly true that health was free, education became free over time, and it's perfectly true that the cost of transport and the utilities and rent was next to zero. Now, that in effect was a quid pro quo for not having anything else, as it were, having very little else. All that was true, and changing over to the market has been enormously disruptive, and they still haven't got there. It's very hard to change those aspects. But rather than seeing that as part of the system, it wasn't part of the system. It was forced out of the system by the instability of the system itself, in effect by the working class. It was compelled to make those concessions over time. It didn't start with it, by the way. You look at the 1930s, it's very different. It comes into being, and if you actually look at it, in the 5 years I was there, I never went to a Soviet dentist. The one thing I didn't want was to end up with an industrial smile, the way they have one teeth taken out and put in large quantities of steel, put into it.
Is that Jaws, is it?
Yeah. The same applied to all aspects of the society. So it wasn't surprising that in Britain, when it came to validating doctors, they couldn't validate Soviet medical treatment. The level was just lower. That was true of education as a whole. If you can have a defective product, you're going to have defective education and defective health. That was the reality. I'm not going to tell everybody the story of how I had my appendix out without any anesthetic. But but it wasn't an accident that didn't give an anesthetic. You can just imagine how many people get too much anesthetic or the wrong anesthetic. Or you used to get, as a student, I used to get told tales of how scalpels were left behind.
That happens in the NHS as well.
I'm sure it happens in the NHS. I'm sure it happens in the NHS. Well, in certain respects, we don't want the NHS, do we? But I'm sure it happens in the NHS, and it happens everywhere. But you don't have this common discussion. It's kind of normal. It's always possible to try and normalize a certain view by saying, well, this aspect, this aspect, this. The important thing to realize is that it wasn't just occasional, that was the way it was. In other words, what I'm saying is you had a defective health system, you had a defective educational system. You wouldn't want to copy it. Obviously, it is better to have something rather than nothing. And it's better that it was free than the present position. That is true. But to say that it was bad then and it's even worse now, and therefore you want what is bad, is crazy. So the point I'm just making is clear that I don't think we have anything whatsoever that one would want to call socialist or is an anticipation of socialism there. What existed there is what we don't want. The only anticipation is that we know what we don't want. That is what we don't want. And I could add to something, just finally just add something more general. There has been, because of Stalinism, a general view that civil rights are extraneous. It's an extra. You don't have to have civil rights. What you need is a rising standard of living, and perhaps control over your immediate environment. Now, it is also true that at some level capitalism can only function with some degree of freedom of expression, which is part of what I've been saying anyway. But in a social society, it would have to be wholly open. You'd have to have full civil rights, as it were, full freedom of expression. And the society would have to guarantee it, and not just guarantee it, would have to organize it fully so that we could have, as quickly as possible, the rise in productivity that we require. After times, you don't go on wanting to rise in productivity, of course. And it is more than simply a question of political economy. Civil rights is a human need. If you have a society without civil rights, people are not able to express what they think to one another. In the end, they can't think. They think at a primitive level. That's what really did happen to the Soviet Union. If you're unfortunate enough to go to I haven't been in the last 5 years, but to a conference in Russia, you'll be bored out of your mind. And the description's okay, but, and of course, they say pure maths is wonderful, but I don't know anything about pure maths. But the conferences that I've been to are just utterly boring because there's no theory involved. And that applies to right or left. You read socialism, extreme reactionary really, and how do you get there? Why do you produce this nonsense, which really is nonsense? Precisely because of the absence of real discussion, forums for discussion, interrelationships, the constant pressure of the atomization, the possibility of ending up in the camp, which he did. In other words, this is not something of the mind, as it were, or only of the mind. It is a human necessity. The Soviet Union managed to outdo the world, outdo any other country in the world in human history, in abolishing all aspects of it. Now it's true, people spoke to one another, but very carefully. And it's true, when you spoke to one another, you had an interaction. By not saying something, you knew the person was critical of whatever it was. But what kind of interaction is that? So the point I'm making here is the importance, the absolute importance of using the word, it's not really the word, but words, phrase, civil rights. It is a material need of mankind that it actually exists. And of course, in a social society, it will be necessarily extended as far as humanly possible in order to build up that society, in order to build up mankind. It is a human need as part of humanity. The Soviet Union managed to demonstrate that in the most extreme way by not having it, by abolishing it. It wasn't that anybody thought it up, of course. It wasn't that, I don't know what Stalin thought, but that anybody subsequent to Stalin actually believed that it should be like it. It's simply the only way society could run and maintain itself until it collapsed. So anyway, to finish, what I've argued is the Soviet Union was no example to the world in almost any respect. You might be able to salvage this, that, or the other in order to learn from it. It's no anticipation of socialism in any respect at all. That within a capitalist society, there are no examples of socialism itself or what socialism would look like. But what you've got is the increasing socialization of production, which has certain important consequences in terms of the decline of the law of value, which in turn leads to a certain number of features of direct of control and its nature, and we're able to anticipate, therefore, the possibilities of what might exist in this transitional period and beyond. And what I've also said is, in talking of the transitional period, we understand the transitional period is not going to be an easy period. It's not very clear to me as to how it can actually proceed under conditions where you don't yet have the incentives of socialism, but have abolished the previous incentive. How it will actually go through the process, I'm sure it will, and I'm sure that there will be practical solutions to it, but nobody's actually demonstrated that yet. So, thank you. Yes, of course, competition has been and is a central aspect of capitalism, but it is not a primary category. What is crucial is the law of value itself. What I said wasn't that it wasn't part of capitalism, but that it enforced the laws. It is not the law. Now that does make a difference. So when you analyze it by looking at what's happening to the laws, and then you can say, okay, there's less. Law of value is not operating. Competition doesn't exist, so the law of value is less likely to be able to operate. That's where you would go. But the point about the SWP is they regard the competition as the law. They stay at the level of competition, and they don't reach any other conclusion. There is a big difference between regarding capitalism primarily as competition and regarding it primarily as value creating more value. There are conditions for the law of value operating, and the prime condition is competition. And of course, what that does mean is a question of how far does competition actually exist. And the SWP doesn't actually ask that question, because if they were able to answer that competition is greatly reduced, their whole theory vanishes. There is no theory anymore, since the entire theory is to be based on competition. And the associated theorists like, forgot the name, but the various associated theorists lose the strength in what they're actually writing. I forgot your second question. So.
Relating to Stalinist and semi-Stalinist theoreticians?
Oh, yes. Well, I don't think you want me to name all these semi-Stalinist theoreticians I think exist. But the word semi-Stalinist, I suppose, what I mean there is various people who come from various traditions but have adopted a considerable degree of Stalinism. That's all what I meant. I don't know how many people agree with this viewpoint, but I made this point many times. With the assumption of power of Stalinism from 1927 onwards, it became predominant, hopelessly predominant, put it like that, over the left as a whole throughout the world. The result was not just that those who were critical were silenced, and sometimes they were physically killed. It wasn't that they maintained the dominance simply in direct terms, as it were, but what was written was and had any influence and remains influential was Stalinism. I've said this many times. It still is the case that various Stalinist textbooks are often the only ones that one can actually find, which nominally call themselves Marxists. People turn to them. So most people are influenced by Stalinism in one way or another. That's one reason why it does seem to be a difference between me and the CPGB, in that you guys still seem to think that that aspect doesn't have to be cleansed out. It does seem to me that it's absolutely crucial. We're all influenced by Stalinism. What we ought to be doing is doing our best to remove it. And we will never get anywhere unless we do actually remove these aspects of reality. It is still, in theoretical terms, very important, because people haven't theorized what it is that's influencing it, what is Stalinism, what is not Stalinism. So that's what lies behind what I'm saying. So in a sense, I'm not directly accusing anybody, though there are some people whom I would say have been more influenced by it than others. And I would say that certain people in the left, as you know, I prefer not to just say Trotskyist, and everybody who's generally a Marxist is a Trotskyist, but certain people who would be in the left in a sense, even though they don't belong to a communist party or a Stalinist party, in my view, are really Stalinist, if you want me to explain it. There's a question about what would happen in a transitional period or socialist society in relation to technicians, or in relation to the question of the white-collar group. Wouldn't you actually get a new technical class? I think you asked. Yeah. That point is very important, and of course has been raised for over 120, 50 years, something like that, in the socialist movement. I think it's there among the anarchists very early on. I think it's in Bakunin. And then further anarchists, in fact, is very much their viewpoint, or some anarchists, that the Marxists, in fact, are arguing a society in which, because they're talking about a party in which the intelligentsia plays a crucial role, the intelligentsia will actually take power. That's what they're saying. And of course, it's true that if you're looking at a party, even if the theoreticians and the Politburo, whatever it is, ultimately comes to the working class, over time they will become intellectuals or technicians, or whatever you want to call it. And it will be true that in the first period, quite evidently, even if you are as democratic as you can be, that in reality, the administration will be taken over by people with a high level of education, even if they haven't actually gone through the education institutions, which is rather unlikely, but nonetheless, even if they haven't. And so, I'm just trying to make the argument as strong as possible. So there is that aspect of reality, yes. The problem with it is that isn't what actually happened in the Soviet Union, even though very often that is what these people want to say. It's true that the former Tsar civil servants, who in that sense were the technicians, did play a role in taking of power by Stalin. And there's a lot written about how that operates, and certainly implicitly that's what Trotsky is saying. But that's a different process. What you're talking about there is not so much the revolutionary intelligentsia taking power, or the technical intelligentsia in itself taking power. You've in fact got a divisions in which the revolutionary intelligentsia is excluded from power, and a particular group which wants to rule takes power. So that isn't what happened in other words, in the Soviet Union. I don't see that as the actual reality. Secondly, of course, in a social society, education will have to be expanded as quickly as possible. I said there is an overall problem as to how it goes, but in principle, if the social society went the way it should go, there should be the level of education should be raised as quickly as possible, so that the number of people who had the skills required would be greatly expanded, or perhaps would be synonymous with most of the society. So in that case, of course, you wouldn't have a separate division. So the only argument in favor of this particular viewpoint would be that there's a short period of time in which the group could take over. Well, again, that might be true to a degree in an underdeveloped country, which is partly why you have what happens in the Soviet Union. But it wouldn't be true to the same degree in a developed society. In the Soviet Union itself, there was certainly that viewpoint among the intelligentsia. You know, the Soviet Union was usually divided in sociological terms between an elite and intelligentsia, which was equivalent to what is called the middle class in the West, and the working class. And the elite did actually partly rule by dividing the intelligentsia from the working class. And so the intelligentsia in general tended to be elitist. It was pro-market, very much in favor of the change in 1989 to 92, very strongly in favor of it. They were violently anti-working class, highly elitist. So that was certainly their viewpoint, the viewpoint that the intelligentsia should rule. They weren't ruling, though. There was a separate elite. And that's why they were in favor of the market. But what happened was, from their point of view, a total disaster. They were wiped out. It's in effect completely wiped out. So that didn't happen as they had expected. Quite obviously, what will actually happen in the transition period doesn't depend, in this respect, Ben was right, on the importance of the political process. I'm not 100% certain whether I would say there'd be only one party. I don't see why there should be more than one party. But let's say there was a party. What you would have to have is a democratic process operate. Or you have to have a process where control would go from below. But that's what makes the contradiction I was talking about. If you have control from below in a factory, won't the workers want to pay themselves as much as is possible, or improve the conditions as much as possible, not do the things which are inhuman and so forth, which on the other hand have to be done in order to proceed. Now your answer is, why don't you just pay them more if they have to do lousy work? Yeah, that clearly would be part of the process, I agree, to begin with. Though, if you know you're not going to be unemployed, and if you know you can get alternative work, would you really have an incentive to get to work in this particular job? Let's say going underground, shortening your life possibly, absolutely not. But would you really prefer to get more money and do it? I don't know. To a degree it would work, but it may not work under those conditions. University Let's